My name is Alexandra Pierce, and for most of my career, I lived in spreadsheets. Numbers were my comfort zone. They didn't lie, didn't bend to emotions, and didn't flatter egos. For 10 years, I had worked as a senior accountant for Greenwood and Company, a mid-sized investment advisory firm in Chicago that prided itself on, quote, integrity-driven growth. I bought into that phrase, integrity-driven. It wasn't just marketing for me, it was personal. My entire life, I believed that numbers could be a shield against dishonesty. They told stories that words often hid. By the time I turned 39, I was one of the most trusted people in our finance department. My reports were thorough, my audits bulletproof. People in the office would often joke, if Alex signs off on it, even the IRS won't find an issue. I wore that as a badge of honor. Clients trusted me. Junior analysts came to me for advice. And my direct manager, Richard Dalton, our CFO, relied on me heavily. He'd often call me into his office, point to a folder thick with transactions, and say, Alex, work your magic. It felt good to be needed, to be indispensable. But over time, I started noticing small discrepancies. At first, they were easy to dismiss. Unbalanced journal entries, expense categories that didn't quite fit, vendor payments just under the threshold requiring secondary approval. Things I flagged were usually brushed off with a casual, oh, that's a client request, or it's just how we're structuring things this quarter. I wanted to believe that. I wanted to believe that the company I gave my life to was as ethical as it claimed to be. Still, the discrepancies grew harder to ignore. Patterns emerged. Funds were being redirected through shell vendors I had never heard of. Dates were manipulated to hide overdue balances. Even bonuses for certain executives, Dalton included, seemed inflated beyond the company's actual profit margins. I knew what it meant. I had seen this before in smaller firms early in my career, quiet fraud, the kind that everyone looks away from because it benefits the right people. But this wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. And I was the one who saw it first, the one person who could either stay silent and keep her job, or speak up and risk losing everything. For the first time in my career, the numbers didn't feel safe. They felt like a loaded gun, and I was the only one brave or foolish enough to hold it. And that's when the thought hit me like a punch in the gut. What happens when you report the very person who controls your career? That was the beginning of the end, or so I thought. The decision to report Dalton wasn't one I made overnight. For weeks I wrestled with it, staring at the evidence late into the night at my kitchen table, wondering if I had misread the numbers, if there was some legitimate explanation that hadn't been shared with me. But every time I reconciled the accounts, the discrepancies screamed louder. Payments routed to, quote, Hillside Consulting, a vendor with no web presence and an address that turned out to be an empty office suite. Reimbursements for, quote, client travel that didn't match any actual itineraries. Deferred revenue shifted into the wrong quarters to inflate profitability. It wasn't sloppy accounting. It was deliberate. I first approached Dalton privately, hoping, naively, that I could clarify things before escalating. I still remember walking into his office, the blinds half drawn, the late afternoon sun casting an amber glow on his meticulously arranged desk. Dalton was in his usual posture, leaning back in his chair with his hands clasped behind his head like a man who never had to second-guess himself. "Richard, can I have a moment?" I asked, my voice betraying a tension I couldn't mask. He smiled in that effortless, patronizing way. "For you, always. What's on your mind?" I laid out the inconsistencies, carefully, professionally, avoiding accusatory language. "I've noticed some irregularities in the transactions for Q2, especially with vendor payments. I think we may need to review these before our next audit. I can't reconcile them with the supporting documents." His smile thinned, just slightly, but it was enough to tell me I had crossed an invisible line. "Alex," he said, his tone shifting from affable to condescending in an instant, "this is all above board. Some of these arrangements are sensitive, high-level strategic initiatives. You're not expected to understand every nuance." That stung, not because I felt belittled. I'd been in finance long enough to grow a thick skin, but because it was an insult to my intelligence. "I'm not trying to overstep," I replied evenly. "But I can't sign off on numbers. I can't verify." The mask slipped. For a split second, his eyes hardened. "Leave the high-level strategy to me. Just do your part." That night, I went home knowing what I had to do. Greenwood and Company had an anonymous ethics hotline, a box-ticking compliance measure that I had always thought was more performative than real. I didn't trust it. Instead, I compiled everything: spreadsheets, email chains, internal memos. I wrote a detailed report, citing every questionable transaction, every number that didn't make sense, and I sent it directly to our board's audit committee, bypassing Dalton entirely. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. No acknowledgement, no inquiry. Just silence. I told myself that meant they were reviewing the evidence. I clung to that hope because the alternative, that they were ignoring me, was too bitter to accept. Then came the Friday meeting. Dalton called me into his office, his tone curt over the intercom. When I entered, HR was there. A woman I barely knew, sitting stiffly in the corner with a folder on her lap. My stomach dropped. "Alexandra," Dalton began, not even looking at me, "we appreciate your contributions to Greenwood and Company, but we've decided to terminate your employment effective immediately." I blinked, stunned. "What?" "Why?" "Performance misalignment," he said smoothly, as if he were discussing the weather. "You've become disruptive to our operations. We need team players, not contrarians." I couldn't breathe. "This is because of my report," I said, my voice breaking, despite my effort to stay composed. Dalton leaned forward, his expression infuriatingly calm. "Your assumptions about internal matters were unfounded and inappropriate. This is the best course for everyone." The HR representative slid the folder toward me, a severance agreement. "If you sign, you'll receive 2 months' pay and continuation of benefits for 30 days, she recited mechanically. "If you don't, we'll have to pursue other options." Other options. The implied threat hung in the air like smoke. I walked out with that folder in my hand, my entire career reduced to a formality and a hush agreement. As I exited the building, the same lobby receptionist who used to greet me cheerfully avoided my gaze. It felt like I had been erased. That weekend, I sat on my couch in the dark, replaying it all. 10 years of loyalty, discarded. My reputation? Probably already being shredded in whispered office gossip. My career? On life support. But the numbers didn't lie. I had proof. And that proof would become my weapon. It was no longer just about my job. It was about what was right, and about proving that Dalton had underestimated the wrong person. The first week after my termination was a fog of disbelief. I kept waking up at 6:30 out of habit, putting on my work clothes, then catching myself in the mirror, jobless, betrayed, humiliated. I tried to distract myself with chores, errands, even baking, but every quiet moment ended the same way, me staring at those spreadsheets, the proof of Dalton's fraud staring back at me. I wasn't just an ex-employee anymore. I was a witness. On the 8th day, after too much coffee and not enough sleep, I made a decision. If Greenwood wouldn't act, I would. I wasn't going to be another casualty of corporate corruption. Dalton thought he'd silenced me with a severance agreement and a vague threat, but he underestimated me. That was his first mistake. My first step was understanding exactly what I was up against. Greenwood and Company was privately held but heavily regulated. Its investment advisory wing had to comply with SEC requirements. The fraud I uncovered wasn't just an internal ethics issue. It was a potential violation of federal securities laws. That meant leverage. I began by documenting everything. Not just the files I had taken before my dismissal, but a timeline. When I discovered the discrepancies. When I confronted Dalton. When I sent my report to the board. I printed everything, organized by category: fraudulent vendors, false reporting, executive bonuses tied to inflated earnings. Every piece of evidence had to be airtight. Then I researched whistleblower protections. The Dodd-Frank Act was my lifeline. It provided strong protections for whistleblowers reporting securities violations, and even allowed for monetary awards if their information led to enforcement action. But most importantly, it offered me a shield against retaliation, at least on paper. The next step was assembling allies. I reached out to a former colleague, Grace, who had left Greenwood 2 years ago after clashing with Dalton. She wasn't surprised by my story. "Richard always played dirty," she said. "I just didn't have the receipts to prove it." Grace connected me with a securities attorney, Jonathan Rivera, whose calm confidence steadied me during our first meeting. "You have a strong case," Rivera said, scanning my neatly organized binder of evidence. "This isn't a slap on the wrist violation. If the SEC takes this seriously, and they will, it's going to unravel Dalton's entire operation." His words lit a spark in me. For the first time since my termination, I felt powerful. But I didn't just want Dalton punished, I wanted to build something better. In the quiet that followed my firing, I realized how much I hated the culture I had been part of. A system where compliance was performative, ethics were optional, and people like me were expendable. I couldn't go back to that. I didn't want to. That's when the idea struck me, a consultancy focused on financial transparency. A firm that helped mid-sized businesses build airtight, ethics-first financial systems, not just for compliance, but as a competitive advantage. Transparency as a service. It sounded ambitious, maybe even naive, but I couldn't shake it. I called Grace again. "What if we started our own firm?" I asked. "One that does what Greenwood pretends to do? Actually operates with integrity?" She didn't even hesitate. "I'm in." For the next 2 months, Grace and I worked out of my small apartment, drafting business plans between legal consultations with Rivera. We registered Pearson Grant Financial Integrity Consulting. We built a bare-bones website and reached out to every contact we had. Grace had connections in nonprofit and small business sectors, and I leveraged my reputation with a handful of former clients who trusted me more than they trusted Greenwood. By the end of that second month, we had 3 paying clients. Small contracts, yes, but enough to prove our model. Enough to prove that people would pay for honesty. All the while, Rivera kept me updated. The SEC had opened a preliminary investigation into Greenwood based on my report. It would take time, he warned, but Dalton was on their radar. It wasn't just survival anymore, it was strategy. I wasn't the victim of a corrupt executive. I was building a future that would outlast him. And for the first time since that humiliating Friday in Dalton's office, I didn't feel erased. I felt unstoppable. Launching Pearson Grant was exhilarating, but it was also terrifying. Every dollar mattered. Every decision carried the weight of survival. Our first clients were small nonprofit organizations, mom-and-pop businesses, and one scrappy tech startup that had been burned by dishonest accounting before. They didn't have the budgets Greenwood's clients had, but they trusted us, and that trust was priceless. I remember our very first big meeting, a nonprofit boardroom with scuffed chairs and a faint smell of coffee lingering in the air. The executive director looked at me and said, "Alex, we don't need fancy charts. We need someone who will tell us the truth about our finances and help us stay clean." It struck me. This was exactly why we existed. This was the antidote to everything Dalton represented. Grace became the face of our client outreach, her charisma balancing my detail-obsessed precision. I designed our processes like a fortress. Clear audit trails, rigorous compliance checklists, and transparency dashboards that gave clients real-time visibility into their finances. I poured my soul into creating a service that didn't just crunch numbers, but rebuilt trust in them. Meanwhile, Jonathan Rivera kept the legal fires burning. The SEC investigation had quietly moved into full swing. They requested documents from Greenwood, interviewed former employees, and, Jonathan suspected, subpoenaed Dalton himself. Greenwood tried to keep it under wraps, but whispers reached me through former colleagues. Dalton was nervous, and nothing scared a man like Dalton more than losing control. Then came the first counterattack. One morning, I opened my inbox to find a cease and desist letter from Greenwood's attorneys. It accused me of misappropriating proprietary information and engaging in defamation that harms the company's reputation. In plain English, Dalton was trying to paint me as a thief and a liar. I was furious, but Jonathan was unshaken. "This is intimidation," he said. "They're trying to scare you into silence. They wouldn't be sending this if the SEC case wasn't making Dalton sweat." We didn't back down. In fact, we went public. But carefully. Grace and I wrote a blog post for our company website about why financial transparency matters. We didn't name Greenwood, but we outlined the systemic issues we'd seen in the industry. fabricated vendors, misused funds, executives gaming the numbers for personal gain. It went modestly viral in professional circles, landing us interviews on 2 small business podcasts and even an invitation to speak at a regional accounting conference. Our credibility skyrocketed. Within 6 months, we had landed a mid-sized healthcare client, a contract 3 times the size of our previous biggest deal. We hired 2 junior analysts, rented a modest office space downtown, and finally allowed ourselves a moment to breathe. But the real turning point came with a phone call I'll never forget. "Alexandra?" Jonathan's voice was unusually energized. "The SEC is moving to formal charges. They found corroborating evidence from multiple sources. Greenwood is in serious trouble, and Dalton is personally implicated." I sat at my desk, staring at the city skyline out the window. My hands trembled. This was it, the beginning of the reckoning I'd been waiting for. As Greenwood crumbled, Pierce and Grant grew stronger. Some of Greenwood's disillusioned former clients began reaching out, quietly at first. "We heard you're doing things differently," one said. "We want to talk." It was poetic justice. Dalton's empire was collapsing, and his former clients were building mine. Still, I knew the fight wasn't over. Greenwood's lawyers would keep coming for me. Dalton would try to smear me, and the investigation could drag on for months. But I wasn't the same woman who walked out of Greenwood's office, clutching a severance folder and shaking with rage. Now, I had an identity beyond that betrayal. I had a company, a purpose, and the growing realization that when the final blow came, I wouldn't just be watching Dalton fall, I'd be standing taller than I ever had. The day it all came crashing down for Dalton started like any other. I was at our office, mid-discussion with Grace about a potential new hire, when my phone lit up with a flurry of notifications, news alerts, LinkedIn messages, even texts from former Greenwood colleagues I hadn't heard from in months. I clicked the first link I saw, my heart thudding. SEC files charges against Greenwood and Company, CFO, for securities fraud. There it was in black and white. Richard Dalton, the man who had dismissed me with a smirk and a severance folder, was facing multiple charges: falsifying financial statements, misappropriation of funds, and obstruction of an SEC investigation. The report detailed how Greenwood had manipulated earnings reports to secure investor funding, siphoned money through shell vendors, and funneled unauthorized bonuses to executives. My evidence was cited, anonymously of course, but I knew exactly which documents they were referencing. Grace burst into my office holding her phone. "Alex, it's everywhere," she said, her eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and exhilaration. "Dalton's done." Within hours, every financial publication picked it up. Greenwood & Co.'s reputation was obliterated. By the end of the week, Dalton had resigned to focus on his legal defense, but everyone knew what that meant. He wasn't just out of Greenwood. He was finished in the industry. I thought I'd feel vindicated, and I did, but the moment was heavier than I expected. Watching the televised press conference, where SEC officials detailed his misconduct, I didn't see the confident, untouchable man who'd fired me. I saw a desperate one, cornered and exposed. He had built his empire on deceit, and now it was crumbling around him. But the fallout wasn't just his. Greenwood spiraled. Clients withdrew en masse. Employees fled. Investors demanded their money back. By the end of the quarter, the firm announced it was exploring bankruptcy protections. Dalton's kingdom wasn't just collapsing, it was being erased from the map. And while that storm raged, Pierce and Grant quietly became a refuge for the disillusioned. The week after the news broke, we signed 2 of Greenwood's former clients, both citing, quote, Alexandra's integrity as the reason. One of them, a manufacturing company, gave us our biggest contract yet, enough to expand our team to 10 employees and upgrade to a larger office. I remember sitting in that new space one evening after everyone had left, staring at our logo on the freshly painted wall. I thought about the woman who had walked out of Greenwood's building with nothing but a severance folder and a shredded sense of self-worth. And then I thought about this moment. Our phones ringing off the hook, our work finally recognized, our future secure. 2 weeks later, I received an invitation I never expected, to speak at a national conference on corporate ethics and compliance. The keynote panel. Me. I laughed when I read it, partly from disbelief, partly from relief. For years, I had been a faceless accountant in a company that saw me as disposable. Now, people wanted to hear my voice. Before the conference, I received one more piece of news from Jonathan. The SEC is closing the loop. Dalton will likely settle, but they're referring parts of the case for criminal prosecution. He might actually serve time. I sat in silence, absorbing it. Justice, not just on paper, but real, tangible consequences. The keynote address became my moment of closure. Standing on that stage, in front of hundreds of professionals, I didn't talk about Dalton by name. I talked about the culture that allowed people like him to thrive. I talked about the cost of silence, the courage of transparency, and the power of refusing to play along. When I finished, the applause wasn't just polite. It was thunderous. People lined up afterward to shake my hand, to share their own stories of whistleblowing, of fighting back, of surviving. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just my victory. It was a victory for everyone who had been silenced, dismissed, or erased by people in power who thought they could get away with it. Dalton had underestimated me. So had Greenwood. They thought they could bury me. Instead, I became the one standing on the stage, telling the story of how I brought them down. Months later, when the storm had calmed, I found myself back at my kitchen table, the same place I had once sat, staring at spreadsheets through tears, feeling powerless. But this time, it wasn't fear or grief that kept me up at night. It was reflection. Dalton had taken a plea deal. He would serve time, less than I thought he deserved, but enough to ensure that his days of sitting in a corner office, basking in unearned power, were over. Greenwood & Company had officially filed for bankruptcy. The employees who once worked under Dalton's thumb were scattered across the industry, some of them reaching out to thank me for having the courage they didn't. And Pierce and Grant? We weren't just surviving anymore, we were thriving. Our team had grown to 20, our client roster expanding beyond anything Grace or I had dared to dream when we were working from my tiny apartment. We weren't just offering services, we were shaping a new standard of what financial transparency could look like. I often thought about how it all started. A spreadsheet. A few harmless discrepancies. A conversation with a man who thought I wouldn't dare challenge him. I had once believed my career ended the moment I walked out of Dalton's office with a severance folder. But it turned out that was the day my real work began. Looking back, I realized that I hadn't just exposed Dalton's fraud. I had exposed the dangerous idea that integrity is optional in business. It isn't. It can't be. And when it's missing, it takes people like me, people like us, to call it out, no matter the cost. I had been underestimated, dismissed, and erased. And yet, I didn't let that define me. The biggest lesson I learned? Power doesn't come from a title or a corner office or the fear you can instill in others. Real power comes from doing what's right when it would be easier to stay silent. It comes from refusing to compromise your values, even when it costs you everything in the short term. I still keep a copy of the severance agreement Dalton handed me that day. I never signed it. Instead, I framed it. It hangs on my office wall now, not as a reminder of humiliation, but as a symbol of the day I decided that no one would write my ending for me. When people ask me how I found the courage to take on someone like Dalton, I tell them the truth. I didn't feel brave. I felt angry, betrayed, and terrified. But I also felt responsible to the numbers, to the clients, to myself. And that's the thing about integrity. It doesn't wait for you to feel ready. It demands that you act, even when your hands are shaking. Today, when I walk into Pierce and Grant's office and see my team, bright-eyed analysts, experienced consultants, people who believe in what we're building, I know that we've created something bigger than any one fraud case. We've built a culture where ethics are the foundation, not the afterthought. And every time I think about Dalton, sitting in a courtroom while I stand on stages speaking about transparency and justice, I can't help but smile. He tried to silence me. Instead, he gave me a voice louder than I ever imagined. This story isn't just about taking down a corrupt executive. It's about proving that dignity can't be bought, and justice can't be intimidated into silence. And if there's one thing I want anyone who hears my story to remember, it's this. Never underestimate the quiet person who knows the truth. They might just be the one who changes everything.